Bengals assistants take center stage here in Indianapolis. Mike Petraglia at the Indiana Convention Center in downtown Indianapolis, home of the 2023 NFL Combine. Of course, on Thursday, the NFL Combine really begins in earnest with on-field workouts across the street at Lucas Oil Stadium. The Bengals will be one of course, 32 NFL teams evaluating the college talent as the Bengals and the other teams prepare for the NFL draft. That'll take place April 27th through the 29th. That'll be in Kansas City. But the Bengals here on Wednesday continued their pre-draft process of interviewing a lot of prospective candidates for draft selection in late April. Of course, they want to know whether or not the particular player meets their mental and intellectual needs to fit in with the Bengals culture that Zach Taylor and his staff have really created over the last several years, a culture that has resulted in a Super Bowl appearance in 2021 and, of course, an AFC Championship appearance just last season. Here on Wednesday, several assistant coaches spoke. First of all, defensive coordinator Lou Anarumo. Yes, he acknowledged he was a little bit disappointed. The competitive spirit in him as a Staten Island, New York native, he wanted to see whether or not he could win the process in Arizona and become their next head coach. He went back for a second interview, but just fell short, of course, as the Arizona Cardinals went in a different direction. But Lou Anarumo is on to the 2023 season and preparing for that season. One of the key pieces that may or may not be back is Germaine Pratt. Germaine Pratt had a career year for the Bengals in 2022. Lou Anarumo is very aware of what kind of production the linebacker had. He had several big plays. Of course, maybe Germaine Pratt's biggest play was against Travis Kelce in the game in Cincinnati, forcing that fumble that led to the 27-24 Cincinnati win. Germaine Pratt forcing that fumble and recovering the fumble by Travis Kelce. Germaine Pratt, of course, is a very intense competitor, and that is something that Lou Anarumo recognized when he said that it was obvious Germaine Pratt was hurt when Joseph Ossai took that penalty against Patrick Mahomes, pushing him out of bounds, a clear penalty at the end of the AFC Championship game. It was Pratt who had some choice words for Joseph Ossai, and then the very next day he apologized for it. And here on Wednesday, it was Lou Anarumo saying he really admired and appreciated the leadership that it took from Pratt to acknowledge his mistake, go up to Ossai, and still say, "I've got your back." Lou Anarumo, as a matter of fact, said he gave Ossai a hug after that play and said, "Just move on. Let's move on. It's in the past. We appreciate and love you, Joseph, and you'll be part of the team going forward." A very, very important part of Lou Anarumo's defense in 2023. So that is really what the gist of the conversation was with Lou Anarumo here on Wednesday. Of course, he is facing the probability at this point that Jesse Bates will not be part of the defense when he returns for the 2023 season. Von Bell, again, that's TBD. We don't know whether or not the Bengals are going to have enough money to afford a Von Bell at the safety position, and whether or not Germaine Pratt would be willing to test free agency and then come back to the Bengals and accept their offer. But certainly those are some of the things that Lou Anarumo will consider over the course of the spring and the summer. Then we had a chance to talk with special teams coordinator Darren Simmons. One of the topics of conversation, Drue Chrisman. Will there be a punting competition? And it was Darren Simmons saying pretty much, yeah, there will be. We'll probably bring somebody in, he said. And if we do bring somebody in, Drue Chrisman's going to have to fight for his job just like he did last season and the season before that. Of course, that's when Kevin Huber was the punter back in 2021. The Bengals deciding midway through this season to make the change to Drue Chrisman. But Drue Chrisman, of course, will unfortunately be remembered for that low line drive punt at the end of the AFC Championship game, allowing the Chiefs to get into field position with a 29-yard punt return and eventually the game-winning field goal following the Ossai penalty. Also, it was Darren Simmons saying that Travion Williams did a very admirable job returning kicks for the Bengals, but that they still miss an explosive guy like Brandon Wilson from several years ago, and they're still searching for that kind of guy. A career year for Trent Taylor. If Trent Taylor comes back as a free agent to the Cincinnati Bengals, Travion Wilson, by the way, also a free agent, but if Trent Taylor were to return, it sounds like he would be the punt returner for the Bengals next year. But again, that is still very much up in the air. So a lot for Darren Simmons to consider at this NFL Combine, namely a punter and potentially a punt returner in the mix for the Bengals as we look ahead to the 2023 season. Brian Callahan, he also spoke here on Wednesday afternoon, and he said there's not much to change about Joe Burrow's game. Maybe some little intricacies that are kind of boring to talk about when you're talking about the quarterback position, but there's not a lot to change. And he loves the way Joe Burrow is progressing as an NFL quarterback. What's not to love? With the T. Higgins situation, he said, look, we know how important T. Higgins is to our offense, really balancing out Jamar Chase on the other side. So certainly Brian Callahan knows that very, very well. But the offensive line is the big question mark. Can the Bengals run the football, and can they be a more explosive team running the football? Will that involve Joe Mixon? Of course, just like Duke Tobin and Zach Taylor said on Tuesday, it's great to have Joe Mixon in the locker room. He's a leader of this team, but can he produce? And that is something the Bengals are going to have to decide. Will he accept some type of restructure of his contract? That is something, as Brian Callahan pointed out here on Wednesday, totally out of his hands. He has to wait and see what Duke Tobin and the Bengals front office decide to do. But the Bengals would like to be a little more explosive in the run game, and a lot of that will be determined by what the offensive line looks like. Certainly the offensive line with La'el Collins and Alex Kappa at the end of last year was very productive, but then both of them got hurt, and Brian Callahan said here on Wednesday, if Alex Kappa doesn't go down, Chris Jones probably doesn't have the kind of game he had against the Bengals in the AFC Championship, pushing the pocket into the face of Joe Burrow on that fateful interception that was intended for T. Higgins. Brian Callahan said he had no problem with Joe Burrow making that throw and throwing that pass and running, because he had the green light to throw to T. Higgins, who was out on a deep fade, but the ball never got there. It got tipped and picked off, and we know the rest of the story at the end of that game. Then it was Frank Pollock also speaking here on Wednesday, and yes, he was asked about the offensive line. The interior offensive line made great strides, but again, they'd like to be a little more explosive in terms of the run game. I had a chance to ask Frank Pollock about changing from the wide zone scheme that he has a great reputation for coaching up to the gap scheme that really fit the mold of the three interior offensive linemen, rookie Cordell Volson, center Ted Karras, and of course right guard Alex Kappa. That's when the running game started to take off. Bengals tried to run the ball and did so very well in the playoff game against Buffalo, not so well in the game against Kansas City Chiefs in the AFC Championship. But certainly Frank Pollock said that he really liked the progress that the offensive line made. And he said that when you're considering Jackson Carman for the 2023 season, he could be the left tackle, but he's also in the mix at the right tackle position if La'el Collins isn't back from his ACL injury against the Patriots on Christmas Eve, or if La'el Collins isn't on the roster altogether because of a possible salary cap cut situation. So we'll have to wait and see what happens in that regard. But a lot of news here on Wednesday. We'll have you completely covered on clnsmedia.com. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at Trags, Trags. And for all of the videos from here on Wednesday, be sure to check out my Jungle Roar podcast YouTube page. Want to hear all of your comments, good, bad, and indifferent. And you can do so by clicking on the link below and subscribing to that Jungle Roar podcast YouTube page. Inside the Indiana Convention Center, home of the 2023 NFL Combine, I'm Mike Petraglia. CLNS Media.